As independent podcasters, the very last thing any of us are thinking about is getting sued by none other than the guest that we bring on. Why would they sue us? So today I've got 10 strategies that you can use right now to ensure that doesn't happen.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening and how are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You know, you can find out every single thing about that show on a website which I built. Yeah, you can check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. And if you can't remember that, don't you even worry about a little thing. There is a link to it in the show notes of this very episode. You scroll on down and there it is. But here is Podtastic Audio, the show that I have created to help you, yes, you, make a better podcast for your audience. And if you're enjoying podcasting, well, congratulations. It's an amazing, fun thing you can do to help get your word out, get your message out. Podcasting is amazing, or even YouTube also. Listen, I'm not discriminating between audio or video. It's all content creation as far as I'm concerned. And if you enjoy it, keep on keeping on. So when it comes to podcasting and the podcasters that I've seen and the circles I've ran in with and the different shows I've listened to, they kind of seem to fall into like two types of shows, really. You have the solo shows, like the show I'm doing right now, where it's just only me. I am doing this completely solo, talking directly to you. There's nobody else here. There's nobody else on the line or on the Zoom call or anything else. I'm not doing a chat room. I'm not doing a live show. I'm just talking directly to you into the microphone, making it very simple, very easy. It is completely solo today. Now, the other side of that would be if I had a guest either in the same room with me or, done remotely or so on and so forth, however you do it. The Chris and Christine show is kind of a combination of both. Yes, the two of us are in the same room, so I guess it's not really a solo show, and we do bring on guest interviews. Now, we've had a big string of guest interviews that booked with us over the next 2 or 3 months, and we've kind of evolved our booking process where we only have an availability to record guest interviews on certain days, and if the guest, for whatever reason, cannot seem to make that day or hour that we've chosen, then that's too bad. We're not going to have them on the show, and that's just the way it is. But we were doing 2 guest interviews this last weekend, and as I'm recording the guest interview, Christine is in the same room with me. We're both in the same room, and we have the guest coming in remotely on their side. As I'm recording this, I'm thinking like, wow, we've really evolved the show. I know now there's a lot of cool ways that you can physically like record guest interviews and make it very simple to do all this kind of stuff. But when I started doing this whole podcast, listen, I was using an old computer hooking up with 2 basic USB microphones with free software and didn't have any idea how to even get a guest to call into the show through the computer, let alone record it and have each of us hear each other's voice, plus hear the guest, and everybody hears everybody, and it all sounds very flawless and seamless. And I'm thinking like, gosh, I've come quite a long way being able to master all that stuff and make sure it all sounds phenomenal. Everybody has their own individual track. It all sounds great. And I know I got tools like the Rodecaster Pro 2, which can handle that kind of stuff. Even a Zoom PodTrack P4 can handle that kind of stuff. But if you didn't have these kind of tools, could you still pull off something? Yes, you could. But it still amazes me that I'm able to pull this stuff off very quickly and efficiently. So today, if you haven't figured out already, we're talking exclusively about having guests on your podcast. Now, if you do a solo show, eventually you might have a guest come on every so often, not all the time. Or maybe you're thinking, I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to interview, smarty pants people on the show, interesting people talking about interesting things, because my shows can be interesting like all the other shows just like it, or I want to be just like Joe Rogan. I'm going to do the Joe Rogan show in my own version of the Joe Rogan show, where I'm going to have somebody come on and we're going to talk for 3 hours about whatever just floats up and comes up in my head. I'm going to just talk about stuff like that. Well, I say good luck and go ahead and give it a shot. You never know until you try. Just go ahead and give that style a shot. And I know a lot of shows have tried that mimic that style of a podcast, and a lot of them have pod faded. Just the other day, I saw another podcast that started in 2020 has just now pod faded, and they claim that podcasting, it's just too much work, and they were not getting the results that they wanted. Hey, a little side note on that is that if you are a content creator, a YouTuber, or even an audio podcaster, if you cannot do your show for free and love it, well, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, because it's going to be a long road before you're making some serious cash, at least enough cash to make it worth your while, if that's your reason for podcasting in the first place. So getting us back to having guests on your podcast, I love having guests on the podcast. There's lots of different ways to do it. You can do it in person, which I think is always probably the best way to do a guest interview, is have them physically in the same room with you, face to face. You feed off each other's energy. It's an amazing experience. If you can do your interview in person with somebody, it's a different experience. It's a better experience, if you ask me. But there's also many different ways you can do things remotely. You can do things audio only remotely. You can do things via Zoom, via Squadcast, Riverside, however you want to do it with a video format. Yes, you can do it however you want to do it. But there are some serious things you need to consider before you have your very first guest interview for your podcast. And now you're probably thinking, hey, Chris, what is there to think about? I invite them on my show. They come on, we talk, we have a good interview. I record it, I release it, and we're done. What else is there to worry about? Well, listen, I've got 10 things that you need to seriously consider when you have that first recording with your podcast guest. These are things that probably could save your butt in the long run, and they're probably some of the best things you have to consider when bringing on another person into your little world of your podcast. So kicking it off with tip number 1 is that you have to have informed consent. You see, they have to agree to be on your show in the first place. You see, you want to obtain informed consent from your guest before recording the interview. Clearly explain the purpose of the recording, how it will be used, and obtain their agreement in writing via a release form. Now, I'll get more into that later. This way, if they say, oh, I never said you can record that, I never agreed to doing any of this stuff, that way you have it before you press record, so everybody's on the same page and everybody knows what's going on here today. Moving on to number 2, speaking of recording, you want to know the appropriate recording laws when it comes to recording somebody for the purpose of playing it back. Obviously, a podcast interview would fall into this category. So just assume that wherever you are or wherever your guest is, just assume that there are certain laws that say they have to be told up front, yes, I am recording this call. This interview is being recorded, and we're going to use this for the purposes of our podcast, fill in the blank, whatever it is. You should get very familiar with all the local recording laws, whether it's federal or local, regarding recording conversations. You see, some jurisdictions require the consent of all parties involved in the conversation, meaning that you're covering your butt and you're letting them know ahead of time, I am recording this conversation and it will be replayed later, but we are recording this. Are you okay with us recording this? Everything I'm talking about today is basically about covering your butt in case the guest does not like your show, does not like what's being said, or perhaps maybe tries to sue you later down the line. So moving on to number 3. Speaking of which, it's release forms. Now, having a release form does help save your butt in case it has to go to court. And they do try to sue you for something that was said or how it was used or whatever. You see, if you have a release form that will cover the use of the interview recording, including distribution through your podcast, Clearly outline the rights granted by the guest and any limitations on the use of the content. You want to be very clear when you have a guest. You tell them this is what it's for and this is how it's going to be used. Are we cool? Is everybody cool? And for the most part, they usually are. Okay, so moving on to number 4, the fourth tip on what you need to do to prepare yourself for a guest interview is to respect privacy. You got to be respectful of your guest's privacy. Avoid asking intrusive or sensitive questions unless they have been explicitly agreed to discuss these topics. Sometimes if a guest come on and we like to ask them and say, hey, what are you okay talking about? What are you not okay talking about? You see, you want to consider editing out any information that can compromise their privacy. Maybe they work for some big company and they don't want the company to know that they're on a podcast because perhaps maybe on that podcast, they said some, trashy things about that company and they don't want it to go back to them, that sort of stuff. Or maybe they want to use an alias on your podcast. However the guest decides to do it, you want to, be cool and say, yeah, I will agree to do that. Your name's not John today. Now today your name is Mike. And Mike, you don't live here, you live there, and that kind of stuff. Basically be cool about it. And that's basically what you got to do with step number 4 here. Now, moving on to step number 5, when it comes to bringing on a guest to your podcast, you really want to set the expectations of the podcast. See, you want to clearly communicate the format and style of the interview to your guest in advance. Get them an idea of what the show is about, who your audience is, who you're talking to, the style of the interview. We do that too with our show, The Chris and Christine Show. We'll tell the guests, this is what the style of our show. It's very conversational. We're going to be, feeding off each other. There's going to be lots of follow-up questions. We don't have a ton of questions written down in advance. All we have is a few bullet points to go off of, kind of like a springboard to get the show rolling, but that's how we do it. Hey, this also might be a good place where you can tell your guests, you know what? Hey, I don't edit anything. So anything you say right now is going to go raw. This is going to be a raw recording. We're going to keep it real. We're going to do it Rogan style. Yeah. So it's going to be a raw, unedited recording, going to put out there in the podcast player. So whatever you say is what it is, and let you know right now, this is how I do the show. Okay, now moving on to tip number 6 when it comes to bringing on a guest to your podcast. This is probably a major one we all should be very well aware of, our recording environment, not only for you, the host, but also for your guest. You want to tell your guest, hey, maybe have headphones on, maybe use a decent microphone, and maybe, just maybe, do the show in a quiet environment. Is that too much to ask? Can you possibly turn the TV off in the background? Can you possibly close the door and have the dogs maybe just outside the room, not in the room barking with you as you record the show? Or just maybe don't do the show from a busy, park or playground or something, unless that's your show. Maybe it's not your show. I don't know. I'm saying let your guests know that, hey, we're going to be recording this. It's going to be audio, maybe video too, but, basically have a decent environment. You would not believe how many guests would come on to our show or any of these shows and just assume it's just a regular, normal Zoom call or some regular phone call, and they don't even consider all the background noise, or they got the window open in the street down below, or they got the TV on in the next room. Like, come on. I mean, you know what? You got to deal with what you got to deal with. I mean, not all guests are cool, but just let them know up front that we are going to be recording and we want to have the best sounding version of you we possibly can get. Okay, moving on to tip number 7, and that is transparency. Now, you want to be transparent with your guest about the recording process, obviously. You want to inform them of any potential edits or post-production modifications you might make to the interview. Some guests just assume it's like live radio and whatever they say is going to be there forever and that kind of stuff. But you want to let the guests know, hey, we have options here. It's not live radio. We can actually cut things out that were missaid, that you didn't say things correctly. Don't worry about it. We're going to take a pause and you're going to say what you're going to say. And I'm going to get that on tape. And I'm going to use that part of the, recording for the finished product. So don't you worry. If you screw up, don't you worry about it. I can fix it. I'm going to fix it, which takes me directly into number 8, which is the editing of your podcast interview. Now, if you do choose to edit your podcast interview, you should do it ethically, basically meaning that, avoid taking statements out of context or manipulating the way the content was said to misrepresent your guest. Maintain the integrity of the conversation. How would you feel if you said something that was totally taken out of context and the host of that podcast decided to use that part, take out the good stuff, and make it sound like you said something completely different than you actually said or meant to say? That would be totally rude. Do not do that. I know some of the stuff sounds like common sense, but you'd be surprised on how podcasters will edit their show to make things seem or sound certain ways, especially if they're leaning a certain direction, say politically, or maybe they're motivated by a particular brand or product. So what you really want to do is maintain the integrity of the actual conversation. So moving on to tip number 9, and that is probably a big, massive one. It's like an umbrella for this entire thing, and that is professionalism. Listen, you are a professional. They're a professional. Be cool, act professional, maintain a professional and respectful demeanor throughout the interview. Treat your guest with courtesy and create an environment where they feel comfortable expressing their thoughts and their feelings. There's a line from the original Ghostbusters movie, and I think it went something like, no matter what happens today, let's all act professional. Something like that. So basically, you got to act professional and be professional throughout the entire interview process. Now, moving on to the final tip when it comes to having a guest or a guest interview recording for your podcast. This is big. Number 10 has got to be a massive step. You write this down. You got to take notes. This one is something that we all should do, and I started doing it because of the Rodecaster Pro and because of tools like the Zoom PodTrack B4, and that is to have a backup recording of the interview. You know what? If the bigger the guest, the more important the guest is, you should always be running a backup recording somewhere of the interview, just because, I do it on Zoom and I'll get the files later, or I'll record it on Zencaster or whatever platform you choose to use. You know what? There's going to come a time where the file is going to be gone and it's going to be garbled or missing or something didn't save right. Who knows what? How do you do a backup recording? Well, it's really simple. With this Rodecaster Pro I have here right now, is that I have my track going to channel 2 or 1, whatever it is, and the guest coming in on whatever internet source it is, doesn't matter what it is, it's going through the USB channel and it's being picked up on the Rodecaster. Also, I hit the record button on here. It records everything, me, them, sound effects, whatever. It's all being recorded on a multi-track recording right here in the Rodecaster, which is great as a backup. I usually use all my recordings on the Rodecaster as just a backup recording, but I do like to use the software because it already gives me what I need right there in Audacity, or if I use Clean Feed or even something like Zoom or whatever, I already have those recordings. Although sometimes the recording on the Rodecaster does sound better than some of the other ones, and it's more convenient. It's super easy to do. All you have to do is push one little button on the Rodecaster, the record button, and you start recording. Whatever you hear, you capture and you have it. Or maybe you can do something like some software, like I use the Audio Hijack program I have installed on my computer. There is a Windows version of it. I'm not sure what it's called right now off the top of my head, but the Audio Hijack version allows me to route the audio how I want and save it and record it however I want right onto the computer. Now, the reason why you do this is just because, like I said, never have faith in just having one recording, especially for a VIP guest, that this interview is very important, or at least important to you to have this person on your show. This guest interview might be your only shot at recording this person. So why not have a backup recording going at the same time? So those are the 10 things you need to consider when you bring on a guest to do a guest interview for your show. And I know a lot of podcasters don't even consider doing any of these things at all, ever. Hey, listen, I hope that every podcast guest you have on your show goes incredibly smoothly. I hope it goes well, and I hope you stay out of court and they don't try to sue you or something like that, because going to court is not fun. Even if it's something simple, even if you think you're in the right and then you can totally win the case, going to court costs money and time. And let me tell you, time and money are two very important currencies we do not want to be wasting. And to ensure that you stay out of court yourself, if you do guest interviews for your podcast, that is to possibly have a podcast release form that they fill out, and you have everything curated specifically to your podcast. Well, you know what? You're in luck, because I just created one that can be used for any podcast covering any guest on any topic. Now, I probably should sell this podcast release form, but what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give it to you for free. It's my way of saying thank you for listening to this podcast. If you'd like your own copy of this podcast release form, all you have to do is email me at podtasticaudio@gmail.com and say, hey, Chris, I would like a copy of your podcast release form. And I will send over a PDF of that form. This is my way of saying thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I want to give back to you. And how can I do that is creating something you physically can use. You can use it for every guest you have on your show. It is amazing, and it will help hopefully save you from going into legal trouble if they decide to drag you into court and you say, hey, I got the form right here. You signed it. It's got everything written down in plain English of what we're going to talk about, how the show is going to be done. It's all right here. So don't you try to throw court in my face if I get everything right here written down. So if you want your very own free copy of this official podcast guest release form, you need to email me, and email me to podtasticaudio@gmail.com. I look forward to your email. I want to say thank you so much for listening. It's been a pleasure being able to do this podcast for you so you can create that amazing podcast. Hey, thanks again for listening. I am also on social media. Yeah, check that out. You can find me on Twitter on PodtasticA. And if you go over to the gram, that is the Instagram, you can find me under Podtastic Audio. Very simple. Give me a follow, give me a like, and yeah. So I will catch you on the next episode.